What it do, YouTube? This is Acid Root. So for the holiday season and the winter and that type of stuff, I'm going to do a series of 2023 reviews and such. And the first one that I'm going to kick things off with is Godsmack's 2023 album, Lighting Up the Sky, which this project has been touted as Godsmack's last album. So I wanted to definitely get to this. I've reviewed everything else by Godsmack, so I wanted to see what this one was about. This is the first album that I've reviewed from 2023. So this is the first album I've reviewed from 2023. So me seeing some of the stuff that 2023 has been up to will be interesting enough to kind of see how that works. But this particular album, I would have to say it's a solid kind of cap off to Godsmack in certain senses, I would have to say, but it just doesn't compare to like earlier Godsmack. And by that, I mean pretty much anything they did before this. Now, this is not their worst album. And I'm not so sure if Godsmack has like a worst album, but I'm not so sure that Godsmack has a worst album, but I would say that this is kind of somewhat mediocre, kind of a little bit above mediocre, kind of subpar, a little bit just basically brushes of average, just to kind of talk about it like that. It's just kind of something where I feel like normally with Godsmack, it resonates like certain kind of feelings about it. Like I definitely to this day I still listen to Godsmack's 4. It's a great album. That's a later Godsmack album that continues to kick ass. Godsmack from 1998 is obviously an excellent one. One of their biggest ones is Faceless from 2003 with hits like I Stand Alone and Serenity and some of those type ones. And even Godsmack's 2000 album Awake is really good. So there's just some good ones. I also like the Godsmack Greatest Hits album from 2007. I don't remember like the 2010 and 2014 albums as much. It's been like 3 years since I reviewed some of those, but I would have to say at least the stuff that Godsmack did between 2000 and 2007, I definitely know pretty well. But I would say there's probably some gems on there, but they just kind of started to switch their style up. They kind of became less alternative metal and new metal, and kind of later on started becoming more hard rock. And that album kind of has like a more grizzled sense. This album has a more grizzled sense, I would have to say, where if it does have alternative metal, which Wikipedia says it does, it's very lightly licked towards it. There was like one song on here that did give me a reminder of Godsmack's first single, Whatever. But apart from that, this is a lot more just bewildered kind of music. And I think obviously by this point they've been around for a quarter century, 25 years. It was 1998 that they put out their first album. So I just would have to say, I don't know, it's just kind of a beleaguering type atmosphere about it. Just because I look after just being able to suppose that it's just the fact that I would have thought that it would have hit a lot harder. It's just kind of bittersweet. I just look after it just being able to say that there's some songs on here. Like I did like a couple of the singles, but I'm just questioning, when we get to 5, 6 years from now, 8 years from now, something like that, how these songs are going to resonate compared to songs like Whatever and I Stand Alone and Speak and some of those type ones and like Voodoo and some of those type ones. It just felt like they had more energy, 25 years ago. And I mean, obviously that's the case for most folks, but just being able to say it just kind of feels like a different kind of more glimmering kind of atmosphere, more so than just like the sheer rage and raucous type attitude that they had in the past. But I just would have to say I like the concept. I'd say I like most of the concept. I mean, this is not a terrible album. Like I said, it's just kind of a notch or two above mediocre, I would have to say. It's just kind of the concept that it just, well, this is more bittersweet. It's just kind of the concept. For someone who's listened to every Godsmack album, you would have thought that there would, it's not to say I'm complaining to the point where it's just like a plock of an album or something like that, but it's just kind of the concept that, when it comes to like the essential must-haves on this particular album, I would have to say maybe apart from Surrender, and maybe the song that reminds me of Whatever, which is Hell's Not Dead, which is kind of an almost song for me. I would have to say this album is pretty much, I mean, for the most part, if you don't listen to this album, I mean, for completionist's sake, it works pretty well. But I just would have to say, in terms of like the must haves, it's kind of light on that. But it's not to say it's a horrid project. It's just kind of this, the energy is just, I mean, Godsmack has always been such ferocious kind of folks. Their band work is just excellent. The riffage has always been great. The hooks have always been menacing and imposing and that type of stuff. Just being able to say they're usually pretty feral, but this just kind of has a lot more resolve and just kind of, stoic, not stoic, but just kind of staid, kind of this kind of sure shot kind of ambience about it that just doesn't have like the same effectualness that you just remind. So this is kind of, it's not, you don't get so much nostalgia as much unless you just start paying attention to the fact that it's been 25 years. But it's just kind of the thing. But yeah, we'll go ahead and talk about the singles here. So yeah, there were 3 singles off this project. The first single is Surrender. So this is kind of a bubbling, stepping out gem, I would say. It's good for brewing happenings, definitely. And it's got some light guitar licks on this song, and it's pretty commercial-ish. So this is kind of the one that's the most commercial of the singles on here. This has like a real kind of this kind of light. This reminds me of like one of the songs that Puddle of Mud did. I think it was called like Control or something like that, that Puddle of Mud did on their 2001 album. I know that's kind of strange reference to have, but it's just kind of something that just reminds me of very light licks. Also reminds me of 3 Days Grace's Break, something like that. It's a real light guitar lick kind of song. It's pretty commercial. This is definitely probably one of the most must-have songs on this particular album, I would have to say. Has typical kind of Godsmack kind of energy, same kind of feral growls and that type of stuff, but it just feels a lot more ambient. It's just more relaxed and comfy, more so than they mostly sound. This kind of the concept. I don't want to say that they're played out, but I just look at the concept. It's just like, I don't know. I mean, the energy is just not quite as feral in terms of like the sheer kind of electric type feel that you normally get from Godsmack, because normally they're pretty ravenous, but it is a good song. I mean, this is definitely probably one of the album's best songs, would have to say. It's a great kickoff to the album, and on Spotify, this is the most popular song. So this is definitely a hit. I want to say this hit #1 on the rock charts in the United States. So it's a pretty good one to kind of have here. Definitely just real hooky and just catchy as far as that kind of goes. It's just vintage Godsmack. It's vintage Godsmack. I can see this song sticking around for a while, but it just, I don't know if it has the last ability. It'll be interesting to see listening to this song like 3 years from now, 5 years. It'll be interesting to see listening to this song 3 years from now, 5 years from now, if it'll have the same spark that like songs like Whatever and Keep Away and some of those type songs did back in the day, I would have to say, but it's a good one. So the second single is You and I, and this is kind of some outdoor hangout festive jive, I would have to say. It's a good dap song, definitely an entry song to kind of have like some backyard shindigs, parties, that type of stuff, smoke sessions, some of those type things. It has a vivid feel about it, and it's just some good summer heat thrills, I would have to say. So this is kind of like typical Godsmack sort of stuff that they did on their early albums and such. It's definitely kind of a summer boiler, but it still kind of feels like relatively, this one has a lot more bravado to it, a little bit more triumphant than Surrender, but I would still have to say it's still relatively blunted. I still feel like the riffs are not quite as carnivorous as they could be. Really, this album, if you're looking for like the most sheer menacing riffs that just really shred things apart, they just feel a lot more kind of subdued and just kind of more like pulling their punches on this particular project. But I do feel like this is probably one of the more feral songs in the album. Definitely has like a relative pretty, I would rank it about 7.5 out of 10 in terms of energy, but I would have to say it's still pretty, it's a great song. It's definitely a good follow-up single to Surrender. It's a great hangout tune, but it just is, I think some folks can probably notice that the energy is kind of blunted here. So that's kind of the thing. The third single, Soul on Fire, this is a song I don't recommend. And talk about some of these songs on here. There's some kind of mid-tempo, high-tempo, up-tempo type songs that kind of have like some riveting kind of energy, but they just don't do it for me in terms of connection. I kind of feel like, I mean, they want to be riveting, but they just don't quite deliver in that sort of sense. There's some songs like Red, White, and Blue and Hell's Not Dead and some of these type ones that are trying to be like jivey kind of headbanging gnarled type songs, but they just don't pull off the energy as far as that kind of goes. I just feel like the riff work is just kind of like B minus C plus list in terms of what Godsmack can typically kind of deliver. I just feel like the energy is good enough to be able to be something to listen to and vibe to, take a swig of beer to, but it just doesn't have the same context as far as like the normal kind of appeal of like what Godsmack has been known for. I just look after it. I mean, I feel like Soul on Fire, I just feel like the riff on there is just pretty basic. It's really kind of pedestrian almost. I just feel like they could definitely have went harder for that, especially if this is going to be the last album. It just was kind of like a more kind of plain and just vanilla kind of ride. Just something that yeah, it's just more basic, I would have to say. It's just kind of the concept about it. But um I mean, I would say for folks that are new to Godsmack and only know like some of their recent stuff, like maybe their 2018 album and things like that, it's not a bad song. Soul on Fire, it's a decent single for what it is. It has some marketability about it, but I just think compared to Godsmack's past, it just has a lot. There's songs that go a lot harder than that, and I feel like it definitely probably should have had a little bit more ravenous, just feral kind of riff as far as that kind of went. It's just the energy. It just feels very stock. So to talk about the songs I recommend on here, there's 11 songs on this album, and out of those 11 songs, I wound up recommending to you 5.5, which is basically about middle of the road. That's kind of the concept about it. So there's, yeah, half the album I recommend. So those 5.5 songs would be Surrender, You and I, What About Me, Let's Go, Best of Times, and the almost song is Hell's Not Dead. An almost song on here is Hell's Not Dead. This is a stock backyard bubbler, and it reminds me of Whatever from Godsmack's first album. I would have to say it's a good track, but it has some basic kind of blunted energy. So I like the feel of this song. Definitely like how it reminds me of Whatever. That's a good nostalgic vibe to kind of get from it. But I kind of look after it. It's just kind of very basic. I don't know. Like I feel like when I listen to Whatever, I still think that that song hits just because it has so much growling kind of energy that just continues to be electric and that type of stuff. But it just kind of feels like I don't want to say that the pungency is gone, but it just kind of feels a lot more blunted compared to some of the stuff on here. It's just kind of the concept where it's a good song. I definitely like it, but I just feel like I know like I if you're coming to this album expecting like Godsmack, if you remember Godsmack from 2003 and 1998 and 2006 and some of those type times, it just doesn't really have a song that just has that shrill kind of like ambient or just shrill kind of freakish energy of I Stand Alone or Speak or some of those type ones that are just real carnivorous. I mean, this is a good like this song definitely delivers on nostalgia, but this is kind of bittersweet nostalgia just because the it's just such it feels so blunted. That's kind of the concept, but it is a good song. It's probably like once again, this is one of the album's better songs. Like I feel like Surrender and Hell's Not Dead are two of the best ones. So it's an almost song because it's kind of basic. There's some songs on here like Red, White, and Blue and Soul on Fire that just kind of are similar to Hell's Not Dead, but just don't pull it off quite as well as that one. But that's just kind of the concept about it. So basically, Let's Go. Let's Go is kind of a gnarled, boppish powder keg bubbler, I would have to say. It feels like Godsmack could still shred harder on this particular song, but it's a pretty lively song. This is definitely one of the most gnarled songs on this whole album, which I was really expecting like a whole album packed full of songs like this one. But this is probably one of the more gnarled songs on this album. This is definitely a good one, but I just kind of look after it. This is probably one of the most nasty songs on the album, I would have to say. There's just not a ton of songs where they get this feral in their energy. It's just kind of like a brief taste of what could have happened. But this is a good one. This is a good highlight on here. It's just kind of vintage Godsmack in a sense, as compared to some of that energy they used to have. But Best of Times is a nice one. I like the riffage on this particular song. Best of Times is definitely a nice one. This is a tense, kind of thrilling, dramatic groove, I would have to say. It's got some good riffage on here, and it feels like mid-tempo metal, but it's pretty catchy. So this one definitely feels like an overcast kind of day. This is kind of another song that feels like a Travers song. There's definitely some Travers songs on here. I feel like songs like What About Me, Surrender. Yeah, I feel like songs like What About Me, Surrender, and Best of Times are definitely some ones that kind of remind me of some out and about kind of ones just to kind of have for like some good Travers as far as that kind of goes. But I just look at the concept that this is another nice one. This is another highlight for Godsmack. This typical kind of Godsmack as far as that kind of goes. Just a nice alternative metal kind of hit. This really works as far as it. This really feels like an Overcast. This could almost be a single back in their old days. I would have said this is just kind of a good, just kind of groovy one for like a cloudy day to something where it's just kind of a little bit more thought provoking and ruminating, I would have to say, but it just works pretty well. What About Me is an imperative, dramatic bustle song, I would say. It's an on the go tune and it's a comfy alternative metal gem, and it's a pretty regular hit. So I would have to say this is just another stock song from Godsmack. It's definitely one that reminds me a lot of kind of Best of Times and some of that type of stuff. This is another one for being on the go and just kind of Traverse as far as that kind of goes. This kind of has that same kind of overcast, it's kind of I really kind of like the wishy-washy feeling. This is just a good ruminating song. I like the wishy-washy feelings that this song kind of gives. It's just another one to kind of have this as a highlight. But once again, like just to talk about some of the songs on here, like the concept about it is there's just not a ton of like really kind of shindig type songs as far as like Godsmack was in the past. If you're looking for songs like I Stand Alone and even like kind of psychedelic type songs like Voodoo, it just doesn't have like that kind of yeah, there's some Travers songs on here. I feel like songs like Surrender, What About Me, and Best of Times are some Travers songs. I feel like Let's Go and You and I are some good, decent backyard kind of boppish type tunes for barbecues and just summer fun. And Hell's Not Dead's another good example of that. But the energy of this album is kind of kept to a minimum. That's just kind of the thing about it. It's just kind of in a more refrained and kind of restrained altitude as far as that kind of goes. It just doesn't have the sheer kind of ravenous bite of like I mean, obviously, Godsmack's early days, the concept about it is just the maturity that's kind of happened across these times. But I look after it still, I don't know. I just question if they really are that grizzled like they compare to be on this particular album. It's not to say like I doubt their skill and the stuff that they've been through, but I just look after it as just kind of that you do kind of want like you know I mean, I feel like the nostalgia factor, the nostalgia that you get on this album is just more for the sake of just seeing how far things have come more so than the actual, like, hey, this is like to kind of talk about the nostalgia factor of this album, I kind of feel like it's more about the fact that time has passed more so than like the hit songs that kind of remind you of like the old days. So it's just kind of like a more bittersweet feeling that just kind of like I feel like the nostalgia works in a sense, but it just kind of takes you more back to like days of the past and just makes you want to go back to those days more so than saying, hey, look at where things are now. And this is kind of like I feel like apart from songs like Surrender, Hell's Not Dead, and maybe like Best of Times, there's just not a ton of like overall addictive songs that just kind of have like some new moments for Godsmack to say that this is some of their best. Like if there were to be like a new greatest hits album by Godsmack, I question what songs from this particular album would be on that particular project. When you look after it, once again, to say 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now, the hit songs that would be picked is like, hey, this is a new highlight for Godsmack, and it's a recent one. I would say, as of Godsmack's latest, these would be the ones, and those would be the ones I feel like have the most feral bite. Would be Surrender, Best of Times, and Hell's Not Dead. Despite the fact that Hell's Not Dead is an almost song for me, so that's kind of the concept about it. There's some Traverse songs on here. There's some decent backyard party sense, but it just does not have the sheer feral bite that they did in the 90s and 2000s as far as I kind of went, and maybe even the 2010s. It's been a while since I've listened to some of those albums, but just to kind of say, let's talk about some of the songs I didn't enjoy on here. So basically, there were 5 songs to talk about some of these, like Red, White, and Blue and Soul on Fire. Like I already talked about Soul on Fire, but Red, White, and Blue is just kind of another flaccid kind of backyard party type song that just doesn't deliver quite as well. It just doesn't have like the sheer riff energy and just overall catchiness that it probably needed. This kind of felt very stock, vanilla, and plain as far as that kind of went. This doesn't compare to Godsmack's earlier days. And then there's like some kind of more homely and kind of heartfelt songs. It's not to say heartfelt like that's a bad thing, but just some of these ones that just kind of have like a sense of dreariness about them that just doesn't quite deliver as well. I mean, I feel like I realize that, and I do think in terms of the time that passed, that's, there has to be songs like this on here, but I just look after it, it just didn't quite have the affability as far as like I would have wanted. So those songs would be Truth, Growing Old, and Lighting Up the Sky, which those just, I mean, I think for folks that have stuck with Godsmack all these years, they probably do hit. Just listening to them, they probably do evoke things as far as that kind of goes, but I just didn't see the concept of when I would listen to them as much. That's kind of the thing. So me basically liking 5.5 songs out of 11 on this album. That's kind of tricky what I'm going to give this album. I think I'm going to give this album like a 5.75 out of 10 because I feel like it does have some hits on here, but this album does have some hits on here, but in terms of like the essential kind of must-have things that are going to make me dig up this project years later and that type of stuff, it just doesn't have a sheer varietized ones of those. Their energy is kind of blunted and just overall more lukewarm and just kind of just bewildered, I would say, than probably should have happened on here. I definitely think they should have went out with a bang instead of like a whimper as far as that kind of went. But it's not so much a whimper, but just kind of like, I just feel like Godsmack is too good a band to just be dropping this mediocre kind of energy. They definitely needed to have more shrill kind of electricity like they did on I Stand Alone and Whatever and Awake and some of those type songs that they had in the past. Just like, come on. This happens to be a thing. So 5.75. The social score as a result, though, I'm going to give the social score like a 5 out of 10 because I feel like some of these songs do have a spark, but then it's just kind of, I feel like listening to this music with your pals, I feel like the energy is just not as comparable. I just feel like obviously the Godsmack earlier days would just be a better choice of what to listen to just because it just has more bite and just overall more ravenous of time. I just would have to say, as far as that kind of is concerned, like, once again, there are some ones on here, like I feel like Surrender is a nice one. If you hear that on the radio or you just hear Surrender on the radio or you and some of your folks know about that song and have heard it, but I just kind of look after it, just being able to say there's just not a ton of essentials on here. There's some kind of flat riffage and stuff like that, and there's just some ones, like I do feel like Best of Times, Hell's Not Dead are some good ones, but just overall the energy is just not quite as sheer. So that's this kind of thing. The social score gets a 5. In terms of the future, like as of the moment, this is Godsmack's last and most recent album, so we'll have to see what happens with it. But I would have to say it's good to kind of complete like the rounds with Godsmack and kind of deliver on some of this, but I just think it's kind of like a bittersweet and just kind of underwhelming feeling that just didn't quite cap things as far as what. And it's not to say like it didn't cap things, but just kind of the concept that the bittersweetness is just kind of more whelming than what you probably may want. But it does have some gems on here. It just is not overwhelmingly so.